Okay, so get ready for this one. Imagine you're at the dinner table and you're passing around a preserved horse penis.
Sounds strange.
Yeah, it's pretty out there, right? But in the world of Viking beliefs, that was like a spiritual experience.
It's just a taste of how different their worldview was. And you asked for a deep dive into this, so we've got a ton of material. Expert analysis, historical accounts, even some poetry.
Yeah, this is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about Vikings.
It really digs into this idea that the supernatural wasn't separate from daily life for them.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't like how we think of religion today. It wasn't all tucked away in a corner of their lives.
Right. It wasn't just going to a temple or praying to a statue. It was woven into the fabric of their existence.
So, like, think about this. For them, it would be normal to leave out butter for the elves, like as normal as paying taxes for us.
Exactly. They were constantly in conversation with this invisible world of supernatural
It's
beings.
a completely different mindset.
It really is.
And speaking of different, we've got to talk about Odin. He's often compared to Zeus, right?
Yeah, the king of the gods.
But honestly, the more I learn about Odin, the more I see like a darker, more complex figure.
It's a common comparison, but you're right, there's a lot more to Odin. He's not just this powerful god sitting on a throne. He's a god of wisdom and war, magic, even poetry. But he's also tied to the darker side of things, like uh, death and trickery and this relentless pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, like that whole story about him sacrificing his eye for wisdom. I mean, that's intense.
It shows his dedication to understanding. He's willing to go to extremes. And let's not forget, he was also a master of Said magic, which was typically practiced by women.
Wait, hold on. So you're telling me this powerful masculine god was practicing magic associated with women?
Exactly.
Okay, that adds a whole other layer to this. So what exactly is Sade magic, and why was it connected to women?
Well, to get that, we need to look north
Hmm.
to the Sami people. They lived alongside the Vikings and practiced shamanism. Yeah, it's where specially trained individuals could connect with spirits and influence nature. And a lot of times these shamans were women. And it's thought that this tradition heavily influenced side among the Vikings.
Ah, okay. So we're seeing like this blending of cultures and beliefs. And it seems like there's this theme of female power,
Uh,
especially with Side, which brings us to the Valkyries.
mm.
But I have a feeling they weren't quite the graceful maidens that a lot of people imagine.
You're definitely picking up on something. The romanticized image of Valkyries, leading heroes to Valhalla, it's not really accurate.
Okay, so what's the real story with the Valkyries? What was their role?
Their names alone give you a clue. We see names like Shield Scraper and Teeth Grinder, not exactly delicate.
Teeth grinder. Yikes. Okay, that paints a different picture.
They weren't passive, they were right there on the battlefield, covered in blood, wielding power over battles. One poem even describes them weaving a loom out of human body parts.
That's pretty intense. Definitely not how I pictured them.
It shows the contrast in the Viking world. Beauty and brutality all mixed together.
And speaking of unsettling, I think it's time we talked about that horse penis ritual.
Ah, yes, the one from the Tale of Volsci. That's definitely one that raises some eyebrows.
So for those who haven't heard, this poem describes this ritual where they pass around a preserved horse penis called a Volsci at dinner.
And they recite verses while handling it, often verses of a sexual nature.
Okay, I'm trying to be open-minded here, but that's a lot.
It is, but we need to understand it in the context of their beliefs. It might seem strange to us, but it probably held deep meaning for them.
So what was the meaning? What were they trying to do?
Well, it's complicated. Some scholars think it might be a later invention, a parody from medieval times. But there are connections to Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir, and the role of sexuality in Sate magic.
Wait, Sleipnir, Odin's horse, is tied to this.
Remember that shamanistic influence we talked about? Shamanism often involves spirit animals, crossing between worlds, altered states of consciousness. Sleipnir embodies all of that. 8 legs, traveling between realms.
So the horse, and specifically its metal,
Mm.
becomes a symbol of power, a connection to the other world.
Exactly. And don't forget, sexuality was a big part of Sade magic. So this ritual, while shocking to us, might have had a very different meaning to them.
That's an important point. We can't judge them based on our modern values.
Right. It's about understanding.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about berserkers, those legendary Viking warriors.
Known for their ferocious battle frenzy.
There's that whole thing about them taking hallucinogenic drugs to get into that state. But is there any truth to that?
It's a popular image, but the evidence points to something more nuanced. Berserkers were probably a small, elite group, and that idea of them using drugs is mostly a modern interpretation.
So what was their secret? If it wasn't drugs, what fueled their rage?
It's more likely they used mental preparation, maybe even a type of trance or meditation, to boost their fighting skills. Remember, Odin was linked to both war and mental sharpness. It's possible berserkers, through their rituals, were trying to tap into that.
So mental discipline instead of drugs.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, could battle itself have been a spiritual experience for them?
That's an interesting thought. Given how deeply connected they were to the supernatural, it makes sense that even war could have had a deeper meaning for them.
Right. And that leads to another question. What happened to these beliefs when Christianity came to Scandinavia?
Yeah, how long did they hold on to their old ways?
Well, the Norse gods were replaced pretty quickly by the Christian god, but those everyday superstitions, the ones tied to nature and the unseen world, those seem to stick around a lot longer. You see them pop up in folklore, customs, even law codes for centuries after the official conversion.
So it's like the old ways got absorbed into the new, creating this unique blend of beliefs.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how much of that old mindset is still around in Scandinavian cultures today, even if it's just on a subconscious level.
It really makes you think. The lasting influence of the past, even as we move into new eras. Well, I think that's a good place to pause our exploration of the Vikings.
Yeah, we've covered a lot, from Odin to Valkyries to that memorable horse penis ritual.
We have. And if you're enjoying this deep dive, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss part 2. We'll be back to explore what happened when Christianity came to Scandinavia, and how the Vikings' unique view of the supernatural might offer some insights into the human condition as a whole. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into all things Viking.
So where we left off, we were talking about how Scandinavia went from those old Norse beliefs to Christianity, right?
Yeah, and it's amazing how those two worlds kind of clashed and in some ways merged together.
I'm really curious about that. Like, what happened when you had these Vikings so connected to the supernatural, suddenly encountering a whole new faith with its own rules?
Well, it definitely wasn't an overnight switch. It took centuries for Christianity to really take hold, and there were a lot of power struggles and resistance along the way.
So it wasn't just a matter of swapping out the old gods for a new one.
Not even close. Those everyday superstitions, the ones tied to nature and spirits, they were surprisingly tough to get rid of. They kept popping up, like in folklore and customs, even in their law codes, centuries after they officially converted.
It's almost like those beliefs were so ingrained in their culture that they couldn't be completely erased, even with a new religion.
Exactly. You got to remember, these were people who lived very close to nature, the sea, the mountains, harsh winters. It's no surprise their beliefs reflected that.
And those beliefs would have been passed down through generations, woven into their stories and traditions.
Right. And that's what makes this period of transition so fascinating. You see this back and forth between the old and the new, pagan and Christian. It wasn't a clean break. It was messy.
So what are some examples of those old beliefs sticking around alongside Christianity?
We'll take trolls, for example. Those creatures, often seen as big, kind of ugly beings living in mountains and caves, they were a huge part of Norse mythology. Even though the church tried to demonize them, people still believed in trolls long after Christianity came along.
They must represent something very real to them, something primal that couldn't be easily dismissed.
Exactly. They embodied the dangers of the wilderness. And even with Christianity offering a new way of seeing the world, those old fears didn't disappear overnight.
It makes you wonder if some people tried to combine their old beliefs with their new Christian faith, finding ways to make them work together.
It's definitely possible. People are really good at mixing different beliefs, finding what makes sense to them. And we see that throughout history, not just with the Vikings.
It shows that beliefs aren't fixed. They change and adapt and find ways to survive, even when everything around them is shifting.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key takeaway here. We're talking about Vikings, but we're also talking about something universal. The human need to understand the world, to find meaning when faced with the unknown.
And that need can show up in some pretty interesting, even unsettling ways.
For sure. And the Vikings, with their complex and often brutal beliefs, give us a window into that human search for understanding.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about Christianity coming in, old beliefs persisting. What else is there to uncover about this world?
Well, there's one more aspect of Viking beliefs I think will really resonate with our listeners. It's this idea that Everything's connected, even in death. That life continues in a new form.
Intriguing. Tell me more. What are you talking about?
The Viking afterlife. It wasn't about being rewarded or punished like heaven and hell. It was about continuing the journey just in a different way.
So not a final destination, but the next chapter.
Exactly. And you wouldn't just be relaxing, you'd be feasting, fighting, basically living a life pretty similar to the one you had on Earth.
Wow, that's an active afterlife. Sounds more like a warrior's retirement plan than eternal rest.
It really does reflect their values, doesn't it? They weren't about sitting around and being passive. They lived lives full of action and challenges, and they expected the same after death.
But didn't they also believe in different afterlives? Like Valhalla for warriors who died in battle.
That's right. Valhalla was a big one, but it wasn't the only one. There was also Folkvanger, ruled by the goddess Freyja, where half of the warriors who died went.
So even in death, they had options, different paths based on how you lived.
And it wasn't just about battles. Those who died peacefully might end up in Hell, which was ruled by a goddess also named Hel.
I always imagine hell as this dark, underworld type place,
Yeah,
like the Christian hell.
it's a common thought. But in Norse mythology, Hell wasn't necessarily a place of suffering, more like the realm of the dead, full of shadows and mist, where everyone eventually went, regardless of how they died.
So a neutral zone, not good or bad.
More like a natural continuation, which is really interesting compared to the idea of heaven and hell in other religions.
It really makes you think, what happens after we die? Is it the end, or is there something more, something we can't even fathom?
People have wondered about that forever. And the Vikings, with their unique view of the afterlife, give us another way to think about death, not as the end, but as a transition.
It's a good reminder that there are many ways to interpret those big mysteries of life and death, and that cultures very different from our own might have something to teach us.
Exactly. And that's the point of these deep dives. It's not just about learning facts. It's about expanding our minds, questioning our assumptions, and engaging with ideas that might make us a little uncomfortable, but ultimately help us understand the human experience better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, I think we're ready to move on to the last part of our Viking journey.
It's been an incredible exploration so far, from their gods to their rituals to those thought-provoking beliefs about the afterlife.
We've covered a lot, but this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn about the Vikings.
If you're as interested as we are, keep exploring. Read a book, watch a documentary, visit a museum. There's a whole world of Viking lore waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe you'll even find something that changes your own beliefs and perspectives.
That's what it's all about. Expanding our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Okay, I think it's time for a quick break. We'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive into the world of Vikings. All right, we're back, ready to wrap up our Viking adventure.
And I think this last part might be the most thought-provoking.
You were talking about the Viking afterlife before the break.
Right. It's different from what a lot of people think. It wasn't about reward or punishment like heaven or hell. It was more about continuing the journey, just in a different form.
So less about a destination and more about what comes next.
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't just sitting around either. You'd be feasting, fighting, living a life not that different from the one on Earth.
Sounds like a pretty active afterlife, almost like a warrior's retirement plan.
And it fits with their values, you know? They weren't people who just wanted to relax. Their lives were full of action, and they expected that to continue.
But didn't they have different afterlives, like Valhalla for warriors who died in battle?
Yeah, Valhalla's a famous one, but it wasn't the only option. There was also Folkvang, ruled by the goddess Freyja. Half of the warriors who died went there.
So even in death, choices, different paths depending on how you lived.
And it wasn't all about battle either. If you died peacefully, you might go to Hell, ruled by a goddess also named Hel.
Hell. I always thought of that as like this dark underworld, like the Christian hell.
It's a common misconception. Hell in Norse mythology wasn't really about punishment. It was more the realm of the dead, a place of shadows and mist, where everyone ended up no matter how they died.
So like a neutral zone, not good or bad.
More like a natural part of existence, which is interesting. It's very different from the idea of heaven and hell in other religions.
It makes you wonder, what really happens after we die? Is it the end? Or is there something else? Something we can't even grasp?
Those are questions people have asked since, well, forever. The Vikings, with their unique take on the afterlife, give us a different way to think about it. Not as an ending, but as a change.
It's a reminder that there are so many ways to look at those big mysteries, life and death. and that even cultures that seem so different from ours can teach us something about those things.
Exactly. And that's the whole point of these deep dives, you know? It's not just about learning facts, it's about opening our minds, challenging what we think we know, thinking about ideas that maybe make us a little uncomfortable, but ultimately they help us understand what it means to be human.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our Viking journey.
It's been quite the exploration. Their gods, their rituals, those afterlife beliefs.
We've learned a lot, but this is just the beginning. There's still so much more to discover about the Vikings.
If you're as fascinated as we are, keep digging. Read a book, watch a documentary, maybe even visit a museum. There's a whole world of Viking lore out there.
And who knows, maybe you'll stumble across something that shifts your own perspective.
That's what it's all about, understanding the world and ourselves a little better.
Well said. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Keep those minds curious and keep asking those questions.
We'll see you next time.